Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Charts Free webinar series. Today, I want to welcome Patrick Guzzle, from Vice President of Food Science at the National Restaurant Association, who is presenting on the power of good communication. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Tara. Thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. I'm located in the Mountain Time Zone, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. A few notes about this presentation. This presentation was originally given by a friend of mine, John Marcello, who is a retail food specialist with the Food and Drug Administration. If you have ever seen John's presentations, some of this information is going to be familiar because he uses a lot of it in his presentations. I've borrowed heavily from John's information, and the information that I will share with you today will talk it's primarily geared towards food workers. However, I think the things that we discuss are universally applicable to anyone in the hospitality industry. So I want you to take just a quick look at this picture here. I've used this picture in other presentations that I've given. So a little bit about me. I worked in the regulatory environment as an inspector for almost 20 years before I joined the National Restaurant Association. And I would use this when I would do a lot of training for the inspectors where I work, or where I used to work. And I would ask them, as you look at this picture, what does this picture depict about communication? Now, we're going to come back and look at this picture again at the end of the presentation. But for now, I just kind of want you to think about this picture and what it might have to do with communication. So we'll come back and look at that Escher print. Escher's a favorite artist of mine. Okay, so when we talk about the hospitality industry, we all recognize that we're based in a people-oriented business, right? Every single day we deal with people, and hopefully we're in the hospitality industry because we enjoy dealing with people. So how can communication possibly be an issue? Well, that's a great question. I'm going to talk with you about some research that was done. Quick poll before we get to that point. I just kind of want to know in terms of numbers, and Tara, I'm going to ask you to kind of help us manage this. I'm not sure the best way to see our answers. How many of you have either represent a restaurant or you represent a hotel where there is a restaurant attached?
So the poll is launched and people are answering it right now.
Yep, I can see that now.
Okay.
So it looks like the majority of you represent either a restaurant or you have a restaurant that's a part of the hotel operation. I think this is important. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. I think this is an important factor because oftentimes when a guest comes into a restaurant that's part of a hotel, if they don't have a good experience, most consumers, I'm going to hypothesize here, most consumers probably don't go through the thought process of, well, I didn't enjoy the restaurant, but the restaurant really wasn't part of the hotel. It's leased space, so it's operated by someone else. And so we're going to disconnect those two, right? I think most consumers probably associate the restaurant with the hotel. But again, the things we talk about, even though this was originally geared towards food workers, I do believe the information we talk about is universal to all of the hospitality industry. A couple of quotes here by some American philosophers, Kenneth Burke and Walter Ong, that both quotes kind of say the same thing. Behavior is ultimately motivated by the values and the interpretation of different situations and events. And they're framed from the receiver's worldview. So that's going to become important to remember as we talk about communication and how it applies in what we are going to be discussing today. Frank Yanis is a deputy commissioner with the Food and Drug Administration, worked for the Walmart Corporation for several years, worked for the Disney Corporation before that. He frequently says, ultimately, all food safety is a behavioral science. This kind of presents a little bit of a conundrum for us because in many cases, the people who are involved with food safety don't have a behavioral science background. And so communication really becomes an important factor. Back in the early 2000s, there were a couple of studies that were done on communication and how it relates to behavior. And again, this was specifically done for food workers, but I do believe it's applicable for all. I'm going to speak primarily about a study that was done by a PhD professor, Dr. Donna Beagle. You see it on that first one. It was done in conjunction with the Oregon Health Specialist Network. So really high level overviews of what that research indicated was that a couple things that were important that came out of that: food workers tend to view their business as low risk. And I'm going to show you some examples of why that's the case. And as I show you these examples, I want you to think about the communication. I'm going to come back and show you some of the specific findings that came out of Dr. Beagle's research. I am in no way trying to have a conversation about the impacts of socioeconomics, but it is an important factor to consider when we're talking about communication and why food workers may look at their jobs as somewhat low risk. The number that you see on the screen, 27,750, that is the current US poverty level for a family of 4. Now, again, I am not here to tell or to have a conversation about what wages ought to be, but if a hospitality worker is earning $12 an hour and working 40 hours a week, and you can do the math on that, I've done it for you on the screen there, 52 weeks a year, no time off, that comes out to $24,960. That's less than the US poverty rate at $12 an hour. Okay, now conversely, if we look at a wage of $15 an hour, it is only slightly above that US minimum poverty wage. Now, again, I'm not here to tell you what your wages should or should not be. What I am going to tell you is, remember a couple of slides ago, I showed you that food workers kind of look at their jobs as kind of low risk. And the speculation is that because of their pay, their thought process is, well, I'm not paid very much, therefore this must be a low risk job. And yet, when it comes to food safety, a person who is not careful around food can cause very severe illnesses and sometimes even death. We'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation, some of the illnesses that can come about through food and hospitality workers. So a little bit more on that research. We can see here that research has shown that workers are more likely to implement safe practices if they understand the importance of those practices. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then one of the findings from Dr. Beagle's study was that real life examples get the food workers and hospitality workers' attention more quickly and help them learn. And I will share some examples as this presentation goes on. Another quick poll here. So I want you to think about, how do you generally communicate your expectations with your staff? There should be 4 options on this poll. Do you communicate through handbooks and written means? Do you have emails and checklists? Do you use verbal communication? Or do you use a combination of all of those? We'll leave that poll open for a few minutes here. Okay, I'm showing 58 participants, and there we go. We're up to 36, 37 responses on the poll. We'll keep it open for you a little bit longer here to see if anybody else wants to chime in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it, but what I'm seeing here is that about 85% of you are using a combination of written communication and verbal communication. That's what I use. And it looks like only a very small percentage of us are using verbal communication exclusively. So this is going to become interesting. Now, I want to stress, again, I myself use both written and verbal communication when I communicate with my team. So I'm not trying to suggest that one method is better than another, but what Dr. Beagle's study found was that sometimes our communication needs to be reframed. So the research that she did in the early 2000s was part of the Oregon Environmental Health Specialist Network. As I mentioned, it was a doctoral thesis done by Dr. Beagle. And the overall findings were that the communication has to be appropriate for an audience, and that it specifically means communication between the person in charge, or PIC, and their employees, but also communication between an inspector and the PIC or the food employees. And again, this was geared towards food workers, but this is universal, I think, across the hospitality industry. So let's look at some specific things that Dr. Beagle found. What she found was that for the most part, now this is not 100%, but for the most part, food workers tend to be in an oral or verbal communication culture. They use stories. They rely on their relationships. Some of those stories become emotional. Sometimes their information is kind of scattered. They use repetition a lot. They'll speak to each other and ask a lot of questions. Conversely, Dr. Beagle's research found that the communication that exists from regulatory people like inspectors to managers, and most managers and trainers to their employees, tends to rely on print communication, books, handbooks, checklists. It's a linear communication flow. It's not scattered. It's very linear and organized. It takes time to read all of the information. And so what she suggested was that perhaps we need, as managers, we might need to consider how our communication methods have an impact. Of course, we want them to have a positive impact and not a negative impact. So a few things that her research suggested was to incorporate stories and sayings with vivid examples to allow food workers to kind of feel what's going on and make that emotional connection with their behavior. I'll try to provide a couple of examples with you as we go along here. Another finding was that role models have to show and model appropriate behaviors in supportive ways. So for example, her research found that it becomes very difficult to correct a message if you are a trainer or a manager and you're telling a staff person, you need to wash your hands. You need to wash your hands. You always need to wash your hands. And then you turn around and that same employee sees you fail to wash your hands at a time when you should have. That is now a problem. And it's very, very difficult to try and to get that corrected. And it was us that created that problem, us as the trainers and the managers. Beagle's research also suggested that information that comes from people with whom they have a relationship, tends to be more of a positive impact. And especially when that communication uses familiar words and real life examples. So here's a really quick example that I will share with you when I was in the field. If you are familiar with this situation, I've taught food safety classes in the past. I've shared this story. And again, if you're familiar with this situation, you're going to know what I'm talking about. But as I talk about this situation, and I've shared it in my classes that I have had, the students really react to it like, wow, I can't believe that really happened, because it's in a food safety course. So the story that I share is this. Several years ago, there was a meeting in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a large meeting. Several different people were attending. I believe the total attendance was between 500 and 1,000 people. Because of the numbers, lunch was provided in one particular day, but because of the numbers, what the hotel did was they set up 4 different buffet lines. Each line had the same food items, and the attendees were assigned a number 1 through 4, and they were told to go through the appropriate line that corresponded with the number they had been assigned. So everybody goes through, they enjoy a chicken and rice meal for lunch. And then later, what was discovered was that the rice on line number 3 had not been cooled properly. It caused a foodborne illness outbreak among all the people that went through line 3 and that had the rice. Oh, what I haven't told you yet was that the meeting was an International Food Safety Summit. As I share that story and I share that last line about how this was a food safety meeting, and several hundred people developed a foodborne illness because of one of the food items on a buffet line, that really leaves an impact, because the food workers that I'm training can understand, oh, gosh, now I get why that rice has to be cooled. I don't want to make somebody sick later on. Okay. So that's just a really quick example there. So more communication methods that have a positive impact on behavior. Beagles research found that verbal information that is provided often and repeated regularly. So back to that hand washing, it's much less of an impact if you tell an employee, you got to wash your hands, and then you turn around and start to walk away from them. But if you repeat it and you make eye contact, that second point there, it really starts to help improve the behavior that we're hoping to see change in a food establishment, for example. Another thing that Beagle found was that there's simply worded signs that are posted as reminders also help to influence in a positive way that behavior. And I will share some examples with you of some simple signs here in a few moments. Now, Beagle's research also found that there were methods that did not have a positive impact on behavior. First thing she found, information that was provided in books or articles. Now, again, I want to make this clear. We have handbooks where I work. We use them. I use them. I use written communication with my team all the time. So written communication is not necessarily bad. It just might not have the same impact as verbally telling someone the instructions that we're trying to really relay to them. Information, as you present it, you need to avoid jargon, technical jargon, and big words. So for example, going back to that rice story, and a method that would probably not have a positive impact on that. If I were to have told the class at the beginning, let me tell you a story about an outbreak of Clostridium perfringens that took place with a specific time and temperature control for safety food. There's a bunch of jargon in there. I've got those big words, right? That's just probably not going to make a positive impact, okay? Information that is provided by people with whom I don't really have a relationship, or with people who have a negative power influence. And Beagle explained that the power influence existed, like, for example, between an inspector and a manager, because the inspector probably has the authority to suspend the operation if something is bad enough, or the manager to employees. Again, there's that power structure there that exists, right? You're the boss of the employees. And so sometimes that power structure needs to be evaluated and kind of broken down a little bit to help communication flow better. Another thing that really can have a negative impact on behavior is the pressure of time and stress. And this is something that we all deal with in the hospitality industry. I deal with it. You all deal with it. I kind of use an example of myself that's not a very good communication method, but I'll kind of, put myself under the microscope a little bit. Several years ago, I went through a Myers-Briggs test, and I'm confident that you're all familiar with a Myers-Briggs test. And I don't remember the different letters that fit my personality, but it was a class of 50-some people, and there were 3 of us that all had the exact same personality type in this group of 50 people. And so each of the groups, as they were divided out into these different personality types, each of the groups was asked to provide one sentence that provided the background for their personality type. And our group decided that our sentence that best fit our personality was something along this line here. I really do care about your problem and what you're trying to tell me, but I'm on a time schedule too. So get to your point. And looking back, we recognize that would not have been a positive impact in that communication method to tell someone what I just all shared with you. Okay. Other communication methods that tend to not have a positive impact on behavior. As I mentioned earlier, if we're not the role model, so information is presented and then we're not practicing what it is that we are presenting, that can really leave a negative influence with somebody. And information that is presented using examples that don't really relate to the life experiences of the people we're dealing with. So for example, with a food worker, if I shared a story about how an undercooked hamburger can possibly lead to an illness of E. coli, and I'm sharing that story with a restaurant that doesn't serve any hamburger on their menu, that's probably not going to ultimately result in the kind of communication that I wanted to create there. Overall highlights, we know this, we're all familiar with this. If we want to change behaviors, it needs to be based on the proper incentives. Threats don't succeed. If we're trying to change behavior and we're using threats to change that behavior, ultimately it's not going to be successful. I'm confident that we all know that. But then Beagle found that there are a lot of barriers to effectively communicating. Remember that power structure I spoke about. So if you think about the power dynamic that exists between an inspector and a manager, Beagle found that there are several different barriers there are barriers as to why that inspector may not communicate effectively with the manager, or the manager may not communicate effectively with their staff. One is a lack of time. I just told you about my experience with the Myers-Briggs tests. Thank goodness I didn't go into a career that's like counseling, because can you perhaps imagine what that would have been? That would have been a disaster if I were in a career with counseling and I were to tell a client, I really want to talk about this, but we've only got 15 minutes to talk about it. Let's get to the point, right? That would be disastrous. We spoke a little bit about the power dynamics, so the authority that exists between the inspector and the manager, or the manager and the employees. So it's just something that we might want to recognize might be a barrier there. We might have a lack of good communication skills ourselves, or maybe there's a language barrier in place or a cultural barrier in place. In those situations, it is in our best interest to try and learn what we can about that culture, or to try to address our communication difficulties and perhaps try to challenge ourselves to think outside of the box. Excuse me. Think outside of the box, challenge ourselves, and find some different ways that we can communicate. As you all know, there is always a high turnover. This specifically says food service. I think it's probably true for all of the hospitality industry. There's always high turnover, right? I don't know the answer to that. I think we could probably spend a whole nother webinar or series of webinars on discussing how we reduce the turnover rates in our industry. I don't know the answer. I do know that it can present a barrier to effective communication. And then the organizational culture where we work. In some situations, I worked for an organization. Here's an example. I worked for an organization where it was perfectly acceptable for a field level employee, an entry level employee, to go and have a conversation with the director of this company. That was part of our culture. That was perfectly acceptable. I then changed jobs and went to an organization where that was not acceptable at all. I didn't realize that. And I tried to just start up a conversation one time with the director of this company. And I was somewhat reprimanded and explained, that's not how we do things here. And I had to recognize there's a big organizational culture shift here that I had to consider when it came to communications. Most food safety information, and I suspect that most of the hospitality industry training that is available, is in print form. I hope I'm wrong with that. I did see on the poll we did earlier that many of you use a combination of print culture and verbal communication. So hopefully I'm incorrect about that. But at least for the food safety world, most of the information is in written formats, and it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes to effectively communicate what we are trying to say when it comes to food safety. So we have to kind of rethink how we're doing things. Again, specific to food safety, most of the information describes the how of food safety. Very little of it describes the why of food safety. And when we do talk about the why, we might present that why in language that is either too technical or not detailed enough, okay? And that you got to kind of strike that balance a little bit. So going back to my chicken and rice example, when I've shared that example in food safety classes, I have talked about how the Clostridium bacteria that cause that foodborne illness is what we call a spore-forming bacteria, which means it's smart. It can sense the environmental change. And as the environment becomes inhospitable for their survival, it creates a spore, which can later break open and release a toxin into the food. When foods are not cooled within the appropriate time frames, that's that environment that bacteria can sense. It will create that spore and then later release a toxin. And then I talk about how the trick is to manipulate the environment faster than the bacteria's ability to recognize what's going on and respond to that change. Just a quick example there. Again, as I mentioned, most food safety education is provided by health inspectors or the agents of the health department. So it's like a classroom style, it's a written manual or step-by-step how-to posters. So in the food safety world, we are being challenged to try and rethink how we communicate our simple messages with the food workers. So some things that we need to consider as we go through those challenges: can we tell a story? Can we go from subject to subject? Can we focus on the big pictures and not the little details? Can we share the emotion and the feelings that are connected with that situation or that particular concept that we're trying to teach when it comes to training? Just some more recommendations there, but let me show you some examples here. I'm sorry, before I do that, John Marcello would say ultimately every technical food safety issue becomes a human resource issue. So those are just some things we need to consider. So these are some posters. The next few slides I'm going to show you are some posters that have been published by the Food and Drug Administration that try to share that story. Now, again, I recognize this is specific to food safety, but this is the kind of concept we're trying to teach here. So this poster, you can see it's in Spanish. We're trying to just simply demonstrate the proper steps for hand washing. And here we're actually starting to get a little bit emotional with this story. We're showing pictures of, a person preparing some foods with their bare hands. Maybe those bare hands were not washed appropriately, so there's some bacteria on their hands. The bacteria ends up in the food, which later ends up in this little girl, who later ends up in the hospital. You can see her wearing a hospital gown there. Conversely, the correct way to do it with the green check mark is to wear gloves. In this case, the germs do not get into the food. The little girl celebrates her birthday. Everybody's happy about it. So just kind of some emotional examples of trying to relay that story. Here's another very simple example here. It's a kind of a short storyboard. In this case, a person was ill. He had symptoms of a virus that we call norovirus. I'm not going, again, I could spend a whole nother webinar on what norovirus is and what it does. What's important to understand is that these pictures kind of show this person was sick. They did not feel well. They went to work anyway, and later kids got sick. So the important message here is stay home if you are sick. One final one that kind of combines some of these things we've been talking about. Again, a person is shown to be ill. He goes to work, works with foods directly while he is ill. You saw some of these pictures in the earlier version. A little girl is later served the food. the young child then later ends up in the hospital because she is experiencing a foodborne illness. One more final one that just kind of talks about what we call the danger zone of food. So the whole point of all these slides is simply to show how a storyboard can kind of be created. We've kind of hit some emotions. We've tried to relay our message with simple graphics and simple reminder signs. And hopefully, at least in the food safety world, we are trying to work on a specific behavior change. All right, back to this Escher print. This is a print called Relativity. If anyone would like to submit anything in the comments, I would just be curious what your explanation might be about how this picture, what does this picture have to do with communication? I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat box yet, but if anybody wants to be brave and submit a thought, I would love to hear your thoughts. It's a puzzle. A point of view affects what you see. It's complicated in a different manner. Communication can be miscommunicated, different perspective. Yeah, you know, and when I share this picture, the simple point that I come back to is this. Oftentimes, we live in different realities. What I communicate may not be expressed the way that I had intended it to be expressed. If you have a partner or you're married, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You may say something and your spouse may interpret what you say in a way that you didn't intend for it to be interpreted that way. And like the people on these different staircases, we're in the same world, but we're living sometimes in a little bit different reality when it comes to communication. And so we have to recognize what our perspective is, what someone else's perspective might be, and maybe we need to reconsider how we are communicating at different times. Really quickly, I just want to speak with you a little bit about a new application, a new app that we have, servsafeops. servsafeops is available. It is an app you can use to really help you implement everything you're seeing there on the left-hand side of this slide. Standard operating procedures, your food safety culture. It's got access to training. It is available on both Google Play and the iStore and the Apple platform. There is a monthly cost, but it's minimal. And it really allows you to really just tap into some great and wonderful resources to help you with food safety, but also I think there are things that are important for all of the hospitality industry in this. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to check out servsafeops. There's a website there in the lower right-hand corner. We'll tell you all about the app, how to get it, what it can do for you, and some other wonderful information for you. That's what I have for you today. I very much appreciate your attention. Tara, I'm going to give you back the control. I'm going to stop. Well, I'm not going to stop sharing yet.
You can keep it up there while we just answer a few questions.
Yeah,
We only have 2 questions right now, but if anyone else has any other questions, just drop them into the chat and we'll read them to Patrick. Patrick, the first question was, how do you recommend overcoming a language barrier?
Yeah, you know, that's difficult, especially if it's a language that you don't speak and maybe the other person doesn't speak the language that you do speak very well. So let's, you know, a common one would be English to Spanish. If you don't speak Spanish and the other person doesn't speak any English, that can be very difficult. That's where sometimes those simple graphics can help relay a message. I think that just if we simplify that message down, try to come up with some visual ways to relay the same information, that can help.
Okay, and the second question we have is, can you speak more about how to make communication appropriate to the audience?
Yeah, great question. So when I talk about appropriate for the audience, I'll give you a couple of examples here. When I speak to the regulatory community, which are sometimes asked to speak to regulators, the information I share with them is going to be a little bit different. So for example, with that chicken and rice situation, if I'm sharing that story with regulators, I probably will start out about, let's talk about a case of Clostridium perfringens that hit rice, and we'll use some of that jargon and some of that technical information. If I'm not speaking though with regulators, I try to make it more appropriate to the audience. Let's talk about a situation where a bunch of people got sick. Oh, and by the way, it was a food safety conference. And that usually kind of tends to relay that a little bit better then.
Okay, so the next one is servsafeops good for proctors to use as well? Can I access student exam scores?
That is a great question. I don't believe you can access exam scores on ops. It would help you if you are a proctor. It would help you to just ensure that the information is being shared appropriately in that ServSafe course. I recognize if you're a proctor, you may not have been the instructor of that course also, but yeah, hopefully that answered that question.
Okay, the next one is, how do you feel about e-learning being used alongside with written and verbal to communicate food safety to staff?
I think it can be a wonderful tool if it's used appropriately. And I think what we have to do when we think about e-learning is incorporate some of the things that were discussed through the Beagles study, making sure that that communication is still applicable to that person, making sure that the message we're trying to relay is in fact relayed, and it's being understood the way we want it to be understood. So short answer is, I think e-learning is a fantastic tool if it's used appropriately, like any tool.
And I think that's it for questions, with one other person asking if there was a link to the study. Do you have that? Is that?
I would have to look for that. I know there are links to the study. If you want to contact me, my email, I don't have it on the screen, I'm sorry. My email is pguzzle, so PGUZZLE @restaurant.org. If you email me and ask me for that link, I will do whatever I can to find it again. It's a little bit of a dated study. I believe it was published in the early 2000s, but I think there is still information to it online. Yes.
Okay, I think that is it. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. That was great.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, everyone else, we will have this recording on the website later today, and feel free to send it to anyone you want. It's open to all. Thank you, Patrick. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you.